There was a small town nestled deep in the woods, where strange things were said to happen. It was said that the town was cursed, and that no one who entered it ever came out alive. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the town, despite the warnings of the locals. As they entered the town, they felt a chill in the air and a sense of foreboding that they couldn't shake. As they walked through the deserted streets, they heard strange whispers and laughter coming from the shadows. They saw ghostly apparitions lurking in the corners of their vision, and they could feel the eyes of unseen watchers on them. Suddenly, they heard a sound of footsteps behind them. They turned around, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder and more frantic, and they knew that they had to get out of the town before it was too late. They started to run, but they couldn't seem to find a way out. Every street led them back to the same place, and the footsteps were getting closer and closer. Finally, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned church. They ran inside and locked the door, hoping to find safety within its walls. As they caught their breath, they heard a voice whisper in their ears. "You can't escape the curse," the voice hissed. They turned around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the doors to the church burst open, and a group of ghostly apparitions flooded inside. They were the cursed souls of the town, and they were seeking revenge against those who had dared to enter their domain. The friends screamed as the ghosts closed in on them, their fate sealed by the curse of the town. And so, they were lost forever in the darkness of the cursed town, their souls forever trapped within its haunted borders. There was a young woman named Alice who had just moved into a new apartment in the city. She loved the apartment's vintage charm and the large, ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. One night, Alice woke up to use the bathroom. As she walked down the hallway, she glanced at the mirror and saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection. She spun around, but there was no one there. Alice shook off the feeling of unease and went back to bed. But the next night, she woke up again and saw the same figure in the mirror. This time, she could see that it was a woman with long, dark hair and an eerie smile on her face. Alice tried to ignore the figure, but every night it appeared in the mirror, growing closer and closer to her. She started to feel like the figure was watching her every move, even when she was in other parts of the apartment. One night, Alice couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a hammer and smashed the mirror, hoping to rid herself of the figure once and for all. But as the glass shattered, she saw the figure step out of the mirror and into the real world. It was the woman from the reflection, and she was real and terrifying. The woman lunged at Alice, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Alice tried to fight her off, but the woman was too strong. In the end, she was consumed by the darkness, her soul trapped forever in the cursed mirror. And so, the cursed mirror remained in the hallway of the apartment, a haunting reminder of the woman who had lost her life to its malevolent power. There was a small, isolated village deep in the forest where strange things happened. The villagers were superstitious and believed in all sorts of legends and tales of the supernatural. One day, a young couple named Maria and Carlos moved into the village, hoping to start a new life. They were warned about the legends of the village, but they didn't believe in them. As they settled into their new home, strange things began to happen. They heard strange noises at night, and their belongings seemed to move on their own. They tried to dismiss it as their imagination, but the occurrences became more and more frequent. One night, they were awakened by a blood-curdling scream coming from outside. They ran to the window and saw a figure in the distance, draped in a long, black cloak. The figure was carrying a large scythe and seemed to be heading towards the village. The villagers were panicked and locked themselves inside their homes, but the figure continued to approach. It was the Grim Reaper, they realized, come to collect the souls of the villagers. Marie and Carlos huddled together, terrified as the figure drew closer and closer. They knew that they were next, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and the Grim Reaper vanished into thin air. The villagers cautiously opened their doors, unsure of what had just happened. It was then that they saw a figure standing in the center of the village. It was an old woman, with gnarled hands and a kindly face. She had saved them, using her knowledge of the supernatural to protect them from the Grim Reaper's wrath. The villagers celebrated their victory, but they knew that they had narrowly escaped the grasp of death. And so, they lived on in the village, always watching for signs of the Grim Reaper's return, and always grateful to the wise old woman who had saved their lives. Anna had always loved exploring old, abandoned buildings. So when she heard about an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist the temptation to explore it. Late one night, she gathered her friends and they set off to explore the creepy old building. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. But her friends just laughed it off and continued on their way. Eventually, they stumbled upon an old room with a rusted metal door. Curiosity getting the best of her, Anna pushed the door open and stepped inside. But as soon as she did, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone in the darkness. Panic set in as Anna tried to find her way out. But every time she tried the door, it wouldn't budge. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. Anna's heart pounded as she realized she was trapped with something sinister. The growling grew louder and closer until she could feel hot breath on the back of her neck. She turned around, and there in the shadows, she saw two glowing red eyes staring back at her. Frozen in terror, Anna could only watch as the creature stepped into the dim light. It was tall and covered in matted fur, with razor-sharp claws and teeth. Anna knew she was going to die. But just as the creature lunged towards her, the door suddenly burst open, and Anna's friends rushed in to save her. Together, they fought off the creature and managed to escape the abandoned asylum. Shaken and traumatized, Anna vowed to never again underestimate the dangers of exploring abandoned buildings in the middle of the night. Once upon a time, there were 4 friends, Alex, Sam, Emily, and Jake. They loved anything that had to do with the supernatural, and one day, they decided to try out an Ouija board. They gathered at Alex's house, lit candles, and started to play the Ouija board. At first, nothing happened, but then the board began to spell out strange words and messages. They thought it was exciting until the atmosphere in the room started to change. Suddenly, the candles flickered and then went out, leaving them in total darkness. But it was not just darkness that enveloped the room, a putrid smell wafted through the air, causing their stomachs to churn with nausea. Then, a sudden heat filled the room, and they could feel their skin prickling with sweat. In the darkness, they could hear something moving, and then, they felt an icy cold touch on their hands. The planchette on the board started to move frantically. They couldn't stop it, and as they watched in horror, the board spelled out a name, Azazel. Suddenly, the room erupted into flames, and they could see the silhouette of a dark figure in the flames. They realized then that they had summoned an evil spirit, and it was out for revenge. They screamed for help, but the doors were locked from the outside. They could hear the sound of footsteps, and the figure's laughter grew louder as the flames grew bigger. They had to escape before they got trapped. Emily spotted a small window that was barred with metal, but she thought they could break it. They used a nearby chair to break the bars and escape. They ran outside and collapsed onto the lawn, watching in horror as the house burned to the ground. The friends were never the same after that night, haunted by the memory of what had happened. They had foolishly played with something they couldn't control, and they had paid a terrible price. It was late at night when Emily stumbled upon a Craigslist ad for a cheap apartment in the city. She had just moved to town and was desperate for a place to stay, so she quickly messaged the poster and set up a viewing for the next day. When she arrived at the apartment complex, she noticed it was in a sketchy part of town, but she brushed it off as she was in a rush to find a place to stay. The apartment itself was old and run down, with peeling paint and creaky floors, but it was all she could afford. As she was about to sign a lease, the landlord handed her a strange-looking key and warned her to always keep it with her. "Don't lose it," he said, his eyes flickering with an unsettling gleam. Emily shrugged it off and moved in that same day. However, as soon as she entered the apartment, strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, objects would move without explanation, and she could hear strange whispers in the dead of night. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed the strange key the landlord had given her was missing. Panic set in as she realized she had no way to lock her apartment door. Suddenly, she heard a creaking noise from the hallway and footsteps approaching her bedroom. Emily quickly ran to the door and tried to push it shut, but it wouldn't budge. She looked back and saw a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. Just as it was about to grab her, Emily remembered a key the landlord had given her. She reached into her pocket and felt its strange, twisted shape. With trembling hands, she managed to insert the key into the lock, and the door slammed shut with a resounding click. The next morning, Emily packed her bags and left the apartment, never to return. But as she walked away, she could feel the landlord's sinister gaze following her every step, and she knew she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. John had always been curious about the dingy old bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that seemed like it had been around forever. He had heard stories about the bar's colorful past, stories of wild parties, fights, and even a few deaths. John had always wanted to explore the bar's hidden corners, and one night, he got his chance. As he was finishing his drink, he noticed a door behind the bar that he had never seen before. It was old and worn, and looked like it had been opened in years. When John asked the bartender about it, the man simply shrugged and said, "It's just a storage room. Nothing to see down there." John's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. He waited until the bartender was distracted, then slipped behind the bar and opened the door. A musty smell hit him immediately, and he felt a chill run down his spine as he descended the stairs into the basement. As he walked through the dimly lit basement, John noticed strange symbols painted on the walls, and strange, arcane objects scattered around the room. He felt uneasy, like he was somewhere he didn't belong, but he couldn't help but feel drawn in. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise coming from a corner of the room. It was a low, guttural growl, like nothing he had ever heard before. John felt a shiver run down his spine as he cautiously approached the source of the noise. What he found was something that defied belief. In a small cage in the corner of the room, there was a creature that looked like it had been ripped straight out of a nightmare. It was half human, half animal, with razor-sharp claws and glowing red eyes that seemed to burn into John's soul. John stumbled backward, trying to run away from the monster. But as he turned to flee, he saw that the door to the basement had been locked from the outside. Panic set in as John realized that he was trapped in the basement with the creature. He searched frantically for a way out, but there was none. As the creature drew closer, John could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He closed his eyes and braced for the inevitable attack. But to his surprise, nothing happened. When he opened his eyes, the creature was gone, and the door to the basement was unlocked. John stumbled out of the bar, shaken to his core by the experience. From that day forward, he never ventured into the unknown again. Once upon a time, there was a man named Tom who was walking back to his apartment after a long day at work. As he turned a corner, a black SUV suddenly pulled up beside him. Two men dressed in black got out and grabbed Tom, quickly shoving him into the back of the vehicle. Tom tried to scream, but a cloth was shoved into his mouth, muffling his cries for help. The SUV sped off, taking him to an unknown location. After what felt like hours, the vehicle came to a stop, and Tom was pulled out and thrown into a dark and damp basement. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear footsteps and whispered conversations. It was clear that he was not alone. Suddenly, a light flickered on, revealing a group of men wearing masks and holding knives. They circled Tom, taunting him with threats and laughter. Tom's heart raced as he tried to think of a way to escape. But as he tried to stand, he realized that he was tied up and couldn't move. Fear and desperation filled him as the masked men closed in. Just when he thought it was all over, the door to the basement burst open, and a team of police officers stormed in, overpowering the masked men and freeing Tom from his restraints. It turned out that the black SUV was part of a criminal gang's operation, and Tom had been abducted by mistake. The police had been investigating the gang's activities for months and finally caught a break in their case. Tom was shaken and traumatized by the experience, but relieved to be alive. He was grateful to the police for rescuing him and vowed to never take his safety for granted again. There was a small town that was known for its mysterious disappearances. People would vanish without a trace, leaving their loved ones with nothing but questions and fears. The townsfolk whispered about a cursed forest that surrounded the town, and how the forest was said to be the reason for the disappearances. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the forest. They had heard the stories and wanted to see if they were true. As they walked deeper into the woods, they began to feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to be closing in on them, and strange noises echoed around them. As they walked, they noticed a faint light in the distance. Curious, they followed it until they came across an old cabin. The cabin was dilapidated and looked like it had been occupied in years. But as they peered through the dusty windows, they saw a figure inside. The figure was hunched over a large book, muttering to themselves in a language that none of the friends recognized. Suddenly, the figure stopped and looked up, as if sensing that they were being watched. The friends quickly backed away from the cabin, but it was too late. The figure had seen them. They ran through the woods as fast as they could, but the forest seemed to be conspiring against them. The trees twisted and turned, making it difficult to find their way. The strange noises grew louder, and they heard the figure's voice, beckoning them back to the cabin. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large tree with gnarled roots that seemed to stretch out in all directions. The tree seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the friends realized with horror that they had stumbled upon the source of the curse. Suddenly, the figure appeared before them. It was an old woman, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. She cackled and raised her hands, summoning a dark energy that enveloped the friends. They screamed as the energy consumed them, and they were never seen again. The townsfolk searched the forest for weeks, but they never found any trace of the friends. Some say that they were swallowed by the cursed forest, while others believe that they were taken by the old woman and sacrificed to the tree. But one thing was certain, no one ever dared to venture into the cursed forest again. It was a dark and stormy night, and Emily was driving home from a late shift at work. She was tired and just wanted to get home and crawl into bed. But as she drove down a deserted stretch of road, a car suddenly sputtered and came to a stop. Emily got out of the car and checked the engine, but she didn't know much about cars and couldn't see anything obviously wrong. She reached for her phone to call for help, but it was dead. She was completely alone and stranded in the middle of nowhere. As she stood there, trying to figure out what to do, she heard a sound in the distance. It was faint at first, but grew louder and more distinct with each passing moment. It was the sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer. Emily looked around, but couldn't see anyone in the darkness. She called out, but there was no response. The footsteps kept getting louder, until finally, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes and carrying a large, rusty wrench. Emily's heart raced as she realized that she was completely vulnerable and at the mercy of this stranger. The man approached her with a sinister grin on his face. Emily tried to back away, but he was too fast. He raised the wrench high above his head and brought it down with a sickening thud. Emily woke up in a hospital bed, her body battered and bruised. The police told her that she had been found on the side of the road, unconscious and badly bitten. They had no leads on who had attacked her, but they promised to keep looking. Emily never forgot that night, and she never drove alone on deserted roads again. She knew that the world was full of dangers, and that sometimes there was no way to escape them.